All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's PSU Transportation Seminar. My name is Jennifer Dill, and I am Director of the Transportation Research and Education Center, and I will be introducing and moderating today's seminar. Our Friday transportation seminars have been a tradition since the year 2000. As usual, today we are holding the seminar live on the Portland State University's urban campus located on the ancestral homelands of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, and Wallala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin Kayapuyah, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. It is important to acknowledge that we are here because of the sacrifices forced upon the indigenous ancestors of this place, remember these communities, and to honor their legacy, lives, and descendants. Today, I'm very pleased to have three folks from PSU here. We have Joe Broach, Sirisha Kothuri, and Nathan McNeil, who are going to be presenting on active transportation data fusion, incorporating big data to estimate volumes. I'll do some short introductions of each of these folks. Joe Broach is a research associate at TREC, and he is also a senior researcher and modeler at Metro, Portland's MPO. He has more than 15 years of experience in transportation research and planning in both academic and public agency settings. His work on non-motorized transportation modeling, behavior, and data has been widely published, incorporated into federal guidance, and used in regional travel models. Most importantly, he holds a PhD in urban studies from Portland State University, also a master's in economics from University of Montana, Missoula. Then we have Sirisha Kothuri, who is a senior research associate in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering here at PSU. Dr. Kothuri's primary research interests are in the areas of multimodal traffic operations, bicycle and pedestrian counting, and safety. Dr. Kothuri is the research co-chair of Transportation Research Board's Pedestrian Committee and Bicycle and Pedestrian Data Subcommittee, and also a member of the Traffic Signal Systems Committee. She received her bachelor's in civil engineering from Osmania University, India, and MSCE from Louisiana State, and most importantly, PhD from Portland State University. Homegrown team today. And then we have Nathan McNeil as a research associate at TREC, and his research focuses on active transportation safety and travel behavior, emerging mobility and data sources, and how to make sustainable transportation accessible and easy for all people. He received his master's of urban and regional planning from PSU and studied history at Columbia University as an undergraduate. Prior to PSU, Nathan worked for the Metropolitan Transportation Authority in New York City as a performance auditor. With that, I'm going to move on. We will have some spring seminars, so stay tuned. You'll hear about those from us. Welcome also, there's folks in the room, but we also have a lot of people online. I'm going to give you an overview. Our speakers are going to go for about 45 minutes, followed by question and answers. Those of you online can use the Q&A function on your Zoom control panel. Those of you in the room can just old-fashioned raise your hand. If we run out of time, we do share all the questions with our speakers. We have enabled closed captioning, but you have to click on the CC feature. We are recording today's webinar. We will be posting it on the TREC website shortly afterwards, along with the presentation slides. And if you are tracking professional development hours, eligible for 1 hour. And with that, I'm turning it over to first Sirisha. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Jennifer. So today, Joe, Nathan, and I are going to talk about our work incorporating big data to estimate active transportation volumes using data fusion techniques. So the talk that we're going to give today has spanned a body of work that's lasted many years, has many wonderful collaborators. So thank you to all of our wonderful collaborators. And yeah, let's go ahead and get started. Okay. Sorry. So the agenda for today, I'm going to cover a little background and motivation for why we started this work. Hand it over to Nathan to talk about the data sources and processing. And Joe will then talk about our modeling methods, results, and applications. And then I'm going to step back in to talk about our key findings and next steps. So in terms of background, as we all know, counts are really the foundation for measuring non-motorized travel. They're really useful for tracking changes over time, for planning and designing new infrastructure, and most importantly for safety analysis, because they give us that exposure metric, which allows us to calculate crash risk. And they're also useful for estimating health impacts. So many agencies have established counting programs for counting bicyclists and pedestrians, but they've realized that because of the cost considerations and resources needed to establish these programs, they cannot establish counters at every point on the network, and these are only available at limited locations. So then our question becomes, how do we then estimate volumes on a network-wide level? So that's been our primary objective. So recently we've had the emergence of third-party data sources. So these are data sources like Strava, which is an opt-in app where the user goes and records their bike or walk trip. You also have apps that run more passively in the background, like Streetlight, which use your location data to impute your mode. And you have other bike sharing apps like Biketown, for example. So our thought was, can we use these third-party data sources to augment our traditional counts, which could either be automated permanent counts collected 24/7, 365 days a year, or our short-term counts, which could be either manual counts or automated counts, and combine these two data sources together along with static data to estimate network-wide volumes. So we've done a number of projects over the last few years, all related to this basic idea of how do we estimate network-wide volumes, both on the pedestrian and bicycle side. And today we are going to only focus on 3 projects due to the interest of time, but we can definitely point you to other projects that are in the works currently. So this body of work started initially with the NHTSA Pooled Fund study, which was between 2019 and 2021, pre-pandemic. This was a large-scale national study where we looked at data from 6 different regions. We had a number of state DOTs and local agencies funding this project. And the idea here was, again, to estimate network-wide bicycle volumes, including Strava and Streetlight data. At that point, a lot of agencies had this question about, can we use these crowdsourced data sources to replace our traditional counts? So this project was trying to answer that question, trying to estimate the impact of what each of these crowdsourced data sources are providing to the model estimation. And so in this project, we used data from 2017 to 2019. Following this project, we undertook a study for the Washington Department of Transportation, where we used the pooled model that we built in the NHTSA study and then transferred that over to Washington. So we wanted to understand the impacts of how this model is transferring both in time and space. And here we used data from 2019 and 2022, avoiding the COVID years. And we included Strava as our crowdsourced data source. Following that study, our next question was, okay, we have all these learnings on the bicycle side. Can we port these learnings onto the pedestrian side? So our NHTSA pedestrian funded study completed in 2024. And here we use data from the city of Portland, and again, use Strava data to estimate pedestrian volumes. So we will be presenting some highlights of each of these projects over the next few slides, and I'm going to hand it over to Nathan to talk about the data sources and processing.
Great. Thanks for getting us started. And yeah, I'll talk about data sources and a little bit of what we did to kind of get them ready for modeling. So first on count data, which we use both as an input for our models, but also to help validate our outputs of the model. So we had permanent counters. These are counters that we had at least 10 months of data in a given year. And we're primarily loop or tube detectors. We had short-term counts, which were, as it states there, we needed at least 24 hours of counts to consider it a valid count for that, but they were typically more like 2 days to 2 weeks, and principally, I think, tube counters on those ones. And then manual intersection counts, which is noted there, we used for our pedestrian study, in part because we didn't have great data from other types of counters. As it notes there, also these came to us in PDF format. We had about 192 of those, I believe, and ran some scripts to pull the count data from those. And so we'll get into a little bit more of the specifics of those as I go through some of the data that we use for the particular projects. So what are our locations for the NHTSA Pooled Fund? As Sirisha mentioned, we had 6 locations for that one. We looked at cities with trying to get a range of geographic diversity, different types of urban location or urban and suburban locations. And yeah, I think, and then in terms of what counts we actually had at those locations, we had more counters at our Oregon location than more years. So ranging between 2017 and 2019 in Portland, 2018 and 2019 in Bend and Eugene, less data in Boulder, Charlotte, and Dallas, but still enough that we're able to, I think, get some decent inputs for our models. These numbers are a combination of both the permanent counts and the short duration counts for those. And I guess one other note is that for the Oregon locations, we were able to model across years because we had the multiple years and see how the model performed over those years, which we couldn't do at the other locations. In Washington State, we had about 73 locations, and we did get them in a range. We have these, I think, 7 geographic regions, six shown here. But we had counts in each of the locations around the state, so we felt like we had a good diversity there of types of locations. We worked with Washington State DOT to gather data that they had, and then we also connected with Seattle and Bellevue to pull in data from their counters. And again, so 2019 and 2022 were the years that we pulled there. We did make sure that these were locations where we could separate out bicycle and pedestrian counts at each of these so that we knew that we had our bicycle activity when we were modeling for those. And then for the pedestrian study, again, these were the manual 2-hour counts at 192 locations around the city. And as you can see, there's a couple of corridors that stand out. This is 82nd Avenue and I think Southwest 4th Avenue. A lot of these counts were undertaken as part of kind of preparing for projects, gathering data for upcoming projects. And so we have some diversity, but there's certainly the interplay of those locations and not as much perhaps diversity of locations as we would want, but that's something to learn about. So those are the count data. In terms of the other sources and the big data that we're bringing into this, Strava data was a big source both for all 3 of the studies. And Strava is a fitness-based app that some of you may use. You turn it on when you start a bike trip or a walk or a run, and it collects your activity. And on the back end, the data is then connected into the OSM network and a trip is assigned to a segment. And you can get outputs at the end of the year for hourly, monthly, or annual totals. There's a graphic down here that shows some of the counts for all of the different links, and it gets more complicated when you have when you have pedestrian links broken out from roadway links. And so one of our challenges was how to bring these like parallel segments and identify which segment a count should be on. But for the most part, we were able to do that, we think, pretty well. There's a note there that the literature finds that there's some bias in the user base, and this is kind of to be expected when it's an opt-in service and the people that are using it may have certain characteristics. They might be more likely to be men, for example, which is the case with this data set. There are other biases in the data set, but it's things that we knew about, and so we can kind of take into account with other variables. Another big data source that we used, and this was just for the NITSE data fusion project, was Streetlight, which is a passive data collection set. So when you use the weather app, for example, on your phone, there might be geographic pings that are connected with that. And that data might get packaged up and sold to a place like Streetlight so that they can then take that and run and impute what your mode was and assign it to a network. One of the challenges, and this is noted here, that it was unavailable after early 2022. That time aligns, you may remember that Apple changed their service requirements on their phones so that any app has to get your explicit approval to track your activity when you're not using it. And so almost everyone says, no, don't track my activity. And so it really made Streetlight's ability to understand this kind of travel behavior much more challenging. And so they've been reassessing, and we haven't had great access to the data in the last, since 2022. But I just quickly note that to access the data, you kind of draw these three gates. And so anybody that traveled through, for example, these 3 points would get assigned to that segment, and we would pull that data. We also used static data. So this is, as Sirisha mentioned, this is an important input for us in modeling. It's basically all of the characteristics around the location where we're trying to model the activity. And we might pull that from the census, from OpenStreetMaps, USGS, for example. And so things like population density, roadway characteristics, things that would affect the level of activity that you'd expect to see on this segment or this roadway. And then finally, we bring these pieces together through this data fusion process, where we basically take these inputs, model the expected volume on a segment or an intersection location. And I'm going to let Joe talk more about the process in the modeling section, but just the idea that these are all the inputs. We take them and use them to output what we think the activity levels are on these various segments and intersections. So with that, I will turn it over to Joe.
Nathan. All right, so it's my pleasure to take you through some of the modeling, and it's it's going to be a little different because I'm taking through the modeling from winding through several different studies. So it's not an A to B journey here, but we'll learn a lot along the way. So I think it's important to circle back and keep the thread of that initial question that Sirisha set up, and I've kind of rearranged her components here and tweak them to represent how we translated that question and idea into a series of models. And our overarching question for modeling, just like the studies themselves, was can we estimate bike and walk counts as a function of these big data sources that are available everywhere and allow us to fill in the gaps where we don't have count data. That's the overarching goal of all the modeling, but of course each study along the way, we focused on particular aspects of that. We were, think about this in 2019, we were starting from kind of a blank slate. We didn't know how useful these data would be. And we were kind of building that knowledge as we went along and trying to answer the questions we could with each data source. So in the pooled fun bike study, our primary focus was, is this new data useful? The corollary to that, once we have access to this big data, there was some thought that maybe we don't need those old, hard to gather data sources anymore. We can just replace it. You already saw the map of all the volumes on Strava, right? Is that enough? So that this was our broadest study in terms of range of location types. And so this was the setting we felt like we could really put that question to the test. We also asked some related questions like how accurate are the estimates, how practically useful do we think this is going to be for an agency trying to use the outputs of this research? And then the question of how much do we need to localize the model? Are these 6 locations enough? If you're not in these 6 locations, can you usefully borrow that model, or do we need to develop these modeling frameworks, everywhere that wants to use them? In the washed up bike study, as has already been mentioned, we were much more focused. We had the findings, many findings from the pooled fund study on these questions, and now we put it to the test. We took it on a little road trip to a new context. Can these fusion models and techniques that we've set up transfer to a statewide context, which the models had never seen before? And if so, how important is it that we re-estimate the models to reflect local conditions versus just pulling a model and using it? Because obviously those of you at agencies know that has very different implications for the cost and resources to implement them. And then finally, with all the findings on bike, how do these bike fusion techniques work when we pull it into a whole new domain, walking? Those of us working in bike and ped research know we're often asked, can't you just do that for both in the same study? And usually, often the answer is no, they're very different activities, behaviors, motivations, and data sources. But we felt like these techniques were promising, the data sources were promising enough that we wanted to see, let's take the way that we use these big data sources for bike, apply it to pedestrian data and activity sources and see where we get. And again, re-ask the question, how useful are crowdsourced data for understanding how people walk? It could be different. So now on to the modeling mechanics, and I promise you this is going to be pretty brief. So we primarily relied on pretty conventional models for some pretty unconventional data sources. And this was not just a one-shot decision. We did explore some machine learning and more flexible modeling techniques early on. The fact was that though our data were big, they were not really big enough in terms of the number and variety of locations to usefully train a machine learning model. In other words, the conventional statistical count models worked as well or better when well specified. So we went with that. For those of you in that area, you might be interested to know that we use those pretty conventional forms, Poisson and negative binomial count models. So modeling counts as a function of the crowdsourced inputs and those static contextual variables that Nathan just went through. Now, this is a little bit different than some exercises when we're really trying to get at the drivers or the behavioral causation or correlation pattern that drives walking and biking. This is different because our key outcome here, we hope, is a predictive model, right? So we're more interested in that. And to be able to do that, I can use an analogy that occurred to me last night as I was trying to navigate my kid's dark room. And I thought I had a good mental model of where all the Legos were on the floor. And it turned out in the dark, I didn't. And so it's the same thing with a model. So sometimes it's easy for a model to predict the data it's already seen and incorporated, right? That's kind of the internal validity. But we used cross-validation and holdout sample techniques to understand how it would perform in the dark, right? So when it was exposed to data that it had not seen, how good did the predictions look? And that it guards against overfitting to observe data that limits the transferability of a model and throwing too many variables in that really have spurious correlation patterns with counts, right? But it also gives us a better idea, or the best sense that we could get of how it might perform when we take it into those areas of the network that are dark, right? And the way it happens, systematically is just that, and you probably use this pointer here, but through an iterative process, segments of the data go dark to the model, and segments are allowed for the model to use, and then the model sees how it does with predicting those that it hasn't seen, and out of that you get some idea of how it performs. And so any of the predictive statistics I'll show you come from the model predicting the data that it had not seen at that point. So I want to, before I dive into the overarching results, I want to mention just some of these static variables that did turn out to be helpful. So one of the takeaways is you'll see this thread running through some of the results is that these data sources, they work together, right? So the static variables or these contextual variables are still important even in the presence of big data, maybe more important. So some of the socioeconomic factors for that were useful in predicting bike activity included income levels, bike commute prevalence, some of the natural features that affect biking either as an attraction or a deterrent in some cases with slope, and then the built environment that of course we're all familiar with and have shown through a lot of research is important, as well as things like just the general context, like the distance away from a central business district, right? And it's interesting to think about this now once we're merging these data sources. The static variable serves two roles. Sometimes it's kind of directly predicting how much biking or walking is going to occur in a location. And sometimes it's adjusting for the bias in the big data source, right? So this income term, for example, we're in areas of high income, what the modeling showed is that for a given number of Strava users, there were relatively fewer actual users, right? So it's reducing that bias of Strava users being higher income. So by measuring that and accounting for it, you get a more accurate picture of actual on the ground activity, not just Strava users, right? So adjusting that map. It was the same with distance from the CBD. When you're in close, to use the Portland example, I think a Strava user accounted for 20 or 30 total cyclists passing that location. Whereas if you move out from the CBD where cycling becomes more recreational, a single Strava user might only reflect 5 in actuality. So that's kind of what when we say we're adjusting the big data, you need to adjust for the bias, that's kind of what we mean. All right, so let's get into some results. The first big question we had, right, was, is the crowdsourced data useful? If so, do we still need the conventional sort of static contextual data? And so, so we don't overwhelm, let's start with just one of these showing so I can take you through it. And what you're seeing here is a summary of the error of the model. All right, so lower is better on the y-axis. And then as we move along, these are the sources individually trying to account for the level of activity or trying to predict. So the static variables on their own, Strava on its own, Streetlight on its own. And you'll note that the error is relatively higher than when we start to combine the data sources, we get better predictions. And what this tells us is, that these sources of data are working in tandem, and that to go back to that analogy and maybe stretch it a little bit, the crowdsourced data know where some of the Legos on the floor are. The static data know where some of the Legos are, and together they give you a better sense of the true reality on the ground in this case, right? And so this is all the local models, and then we also had 2 pooled models here on the right side that we developed, one for the Oregon locations and one which was an all city, somewhat of a nationwide model. And we just want to point out a couple of things. The first thing is that pattern tends to persist across locations, and that as you combine data sources, performance improves. And just to head this off at the pass, remember these are based on those prediction of data not seen. So yes, if you throw more variables in a model, the internal performance is always going to improve, but you don't know about the external predictive performance. And so this is this reflects an actual increase in performance. And generally, when you combine all 3 of our data sources that Nathan mentioned, the static variables, the Strava counts, and Streetlight predicted volumes or indices, you got the lowest error, the best predictive performance. Now, there are some cases where that's slightly inverted. We'll go with the exception that proves the rule, and the differences are not that dramatic. But particularly in Boulder, you'll notice, and in Dallas, were 2 places where the crowdsourced data performed pretty well, even in the absence of static kind of adjustment factors. The reasons for this, we think, are a couple. One of them is the Strava, in particular, the Strava rates of use in those places were very high. Most of the counters were on recreational trails and in Boulder, kind of outlying, honestly, highway shoulders, but that were used by a lot of recreational cyclists. And we saw rates of Strava capture over 30%. So, you know, one of every three bike passing by had the Strava app logging. And so they weren't as, you know, they were less biased in these locations. They captured more of the total picture. But in most cases, you know, you do better to combine the data sources. And even there, it was better to combine the two crowdsourced data sources. An interesting point that they can in some ways adjust for one another since they're coming from independent sources. One other thing to note here, you probably have already caught it, but those error bars are quite a bit higher to the right than they are to the left. Localizing a model does pay dividends. It's you know, not earth-shattering result, but it helps to localize the model, and for reasons like I was just saying, the rates of Strava use are going to vary from location to location. The impact of contextual factors, just the background levels of cycling, right, are going to differ. And so there are pretty good rewards to customizing the model to fit in terms of the variables included and the estimation. So before I go on, I should say, so this gets to the question of, are these data sources statistically useful? But we know that there's sometimes a difference between statistically useful and significant and practically useful. And so we also wanted to be able to speak to that. And now we're getting into that domain. What are the error rates that we're talking about? Not as a % root mean squared error, which doesn't mean a lot to most of us out of context, but in terms of actual prediction error. So here we're seeing the mean average % error by volume bin. So for each of these locations, what you're seeing is for low volume sites, the high bars, for kind of mid volume sites, which are roughly say 100 plus cyclists per day, and then higher volume sites, which are those which are typically over 300 cyclists per day. And you notice, I mean, I don't have to spell out the pattern to you here. The low volume sites were tough for the model to predict. When you're getting down to, you know, like 20 cyclists a day, it can be very idiosyncratic. It's something about the location. There could be, you know, 20 trips a day generated by one bike-friendly employer or business nearby, or a popular trail access or something. So it's tough for a model, you know, to generalize that. Once we get to the middle, the middle and high volume sites, though, depending on your background and if you work in motor vehicle volume estimation, you might see rates of 30 to 40% error as somewhat high. So that would be like at a site with 100 cyclists per day. In reality, you might predict plus or minus 30 or 40 from that. But when you look at lower volume motor vehicle sites, and we did that in our report, collected some information from other studies, it is extremely comparable. The 30-40% is also what's been seen using big data to estimate motor vehicle volume at lower volume sites. On a freeway, you can do much better. No surprise, there are a lot more phones traveling through, right? So you're getting a bigger sample. But this was really heartening that we could, you know, put sort of active travel, biking at least kind of on par with motor vehicle estimation, and within a range we think is useful. Not always. Sometimes 40% is too much error for an application, but it's, you know, it's a good starting point. So moving on. How do these travel? Because it's, you know, it's one thing to quote unquote solve the problem for 6 locations, 3 of them in Oregon, but what if you're not one of those 6 places, what could you expect? And the Washington DOT staff approached us and asked us, could you transfer that model to statewide in Washington? And we thought about it and said, yeah, I mean, I think it'd be a useful exercise. We don't know exactly what to expect. But we do have some idea, right? We calculated our expected error rates, and this is the sum of over all those kind of volume bins and things. And then we put it to the test. We took the model to Washington at those 70 locations that Nathan showed you earlier, and we tried it 2 ways. One was just naively, you take the model with the parameters from the report, and you apply it to the data in Washington State, and in general, static model accepted. You know, it fell more or less within the range of our expectation, which is good. It says that we know how much we don't know, and that's a starting point, right? We knew kind of what to expect the performance to be. And importantly, this was true. We had some questions about how this would hold up across time, especially over a pandemic, right? And to be honest, you know, things didn't fall apart. The error rates certainly increased as you go over time, but not dramatically so. So we think the structure is sound. It held up to even the COVID events. We also did it with re-estimation. So we didn't re-specify the models because we thought there would be very few agencies with kind of the capacity capability to re-specify, say, the set of variables or the calculation of specific static variables and things, but just re-estimating. So re-estimating the parameters to localize the model forms we had already developed. And that certainly improved things. It basically put it below, you know, better than our expectation of range. That's interesting. Also came up with the interesting note that these combined models where we're triangulating on the truth seem to be more robust. So if you aren't going to be able to re-estimate or redo your models, better to start with the one that's combining data sources. And I think intuitively that makes sense to us. We're averaging out some error, hopefully, and getting a more general result. So we were able to answer the question of, will the model travel? Well, at least to our neighboring state to the north, right? So not a complete test, but a good first try. And now to kind of wrap up this section, I want to talk a little bit about our adventures in pedestrian model. Nathan already alluded to the fact that it's honestly the walking behavior is just tougher. The base network data, the range of options that someone walking has is so challenging. And the way that it's counted historically has been a little different. As Nathan mentioned, it's typically counted as kind of something like entering volumes at an intersection. So someone is there and everyone that comes into the intersection is counted, and then you get, you know, a sum or a sum by the leg that's entering. Just fusing that was a huge challenge. So the first thing we did is back off the idea of getting an average annual pedestrian flow from this, because we didn't have the support of enough permanent counters. So we couldn't get the pattern. We couldn't get the daily pattern to then expand these short-term counts from. So I'm sure Sirisha will talk about that as one takeaway. We need more of the permanent pedestrian counts to get these patterns. But even backing off to that is tough. So these are not the real numbers, because Strava doesn't want this shown outside of our research world, that these are fudged numbers, but this is what it looks like more or less in terms of what to do. So you imagine you're having a clipboard count of entering pedestrian volumes, and then you get this from Strava of walking and running use from the app. And how do you turn this into an entering volume? It took a lot of iterations. We feel pretty confident in the methodology we went through. Feel free to reach out if you're trying to do the same. But it's not this data fusion is not so much as just plus this, right? It's each one of these can become its own little sub-study. Once we were able to do that, we were able to kind of recreate that bicycle modeling concept with the pedestrian count and the supplementary data sources. And our result is Ped Fusion has potential. I'll be very frank. We were pretty pessimistic going in, especially once we saw the data available to us, and it surprised us how well things work, to be honest. And that doesn't always happen in this type of work. It was very sort of experimental. In terms of model fit and prediction ability, not quite as good as on the bike side, I would say, but getting to that useful range. So we were seeing error rates with the best of the models down under 60%. So, getting you in the ballpark of kind of the at least the range of the level of use at a location, which can be really helpful when you're going in blind. And and you can kind of see from these charts, and I should have mentioned those before I went ahead, is up top, you're seeing this is the internal, that lights on model performance, and on the line would be perfect prediction, and off the line are the misses. And you kind of see from the scales that they're errors, but they're not to the point where things are unusable. And down here is our holdout sample. So we had a true holdout for pedestrian, not the cross-validation technique, but 20 sites we randomly pulled and the model never saw. And then we used the predictions to see how it did. And again, you know, it's providing, I think, useful estimates, if not perfect. Some of the significant static predictors on the pedestrian side for those interested at the intersection were the kind of the entering types of roadways, which were classified by their speeds, their joint speeds. The adjacent land use, any crossing aids that were there, of course, will potentially draw pedestrians in, and then some examples of pedestrian-oriented activity within a pretty short distance around the site. The Strava activities, to answer another question in this study, were helpful. We wondered about this because while biking, if you look overall in the state of Oregon, about 30% of the recorded Strava trips last year were labeled by the user as, or not labeled by the user, labeled by Strava as utilitarian for commuting or some purpose like that, non-recreational, 30%. For pedestrian, sub 5%. It's mostly running trips, but there's still some useful information there according to the model. So that this kind of, and this is very much a background level of running and walking captured by Strava at an annual scale is helpful in predicting 2-hour peak head volumes, and it's significantly so. And I think that's a finding worth kind of carrying forward and exploring more. We were skeptical, but I think it merits more research. I'm going to quickly just show you how these things can be applied, and then hand it back over to Sirisha for some takeaways and then some questions. And really, these are pre-applications. What do you get out of all of this work, hopefully, that then you can apply to safety, to a health analysis, to a project level planning exercise. From those dots, those are the permanent in the darker colored purple, and the short duration bite counts from the pooled fund study. Those are the locations where we had information. That was about 100. And then these are the 250,000 locations where we did not have information. So the ability to project out from the things that you do know to the areas where you don't is one very key application that underlies the research. You saw from those error rates at least an idea of the kind of accuracy that might be for a specific location, but it's feasible, at least at a regional scale. This is computationally challenging, though. We generate all those static variables, for 88 locations in the modeling exercise. Again, we do it for our 250,000 locations, because each street segment becomes its own kind of pseudo count site. It becomes a location that you have to analyze separately. So it's computationally tough, but it's feasible, at least at a regional scale. In Washington State, it was not immediately feasible without some heavier computer science work. And so we talked to them. We could spend our resources figuring out how to do that statewide and for the network. And the WashDOT folks thought, it's cool, but it's not how we really work. We usually have a corridor and a small surrounding area that we're focusing on at a project level. And that would almost be as or more useful than the whole network worth of volumes. If we could know that this area we have some safety concerns about or are interested in planning for a future project, what are some ballpark ideas of the current usage where we have no knowledge previously? So we tried it in a corridor application. So their staff identified these 2 state highway corridors with fairly recently installed bike lanes, just striped lanes, where they had no history of counts, bicycle counts, and they were just curious what they would get from a model. So we applied those models to the corridors. These are the 2, SR 510 on the left and SR 7 on the right. When familiar with these areas, but pretty typical. Most of them are very developed alongside lots of driveways. It's just classic state highway challenge. And this is what you get. If you just do it on the corridor, you get predicted average annual bike volumes on the left. And you see it's fairly consistent along the length of the corridor. That's some helpful information if you were planning to do some actual on the ground studies or checks. And then on the right, we went out a half a mile. So you get a little more of the context of biking in the area, and you can see things like, you know, there's an important crossing bicycle route at this location and some feeder routes. No obvious parallel kind of alternative routes though. So it's, you know, if you're thinking from a planning perspective, this is kind of the route through here and the cyclists are not finding much of a way around it. A little different in the other location where you see a pretty strong difference in terms of the level of predicted, again, bicycle activity, much higher in the south than the northern part of the stretch, again, potentially useful for different analyses and planning, and also a much different picture, more parallel traffic. In fact, there's a route that our model predicts is probably used more heavily by cyclists, maybe avoiding the state highway route, we don't know, and then a very high amount of use on a crossing facility that leads into some trails. And so you can kind of see this is not the end of an analysis, but it's a really helpful initial input versus, you know, going in pretty much blind. And WashDOT is hoping to follow up by putting some counters on the ground in each of these corridors and doing kind of a true real world validation, which I think is going to be really helpful too. And I'm going to hand it back over to Sirisha. Through the end. Thanks, Sirisha.
Thanks, Joe. So I'm going to try to wrap up quickly because I know we want to leave some time for questions. So in terms of findings, Joe mentioned this earlier. So our basic question was, can crowdsourced data improve model estimates? And the answer is yes. We found that both on the bicycle and pedestrian side, it can significantly improve our volume estimates. But then can these replace our traditional counters? The answer is no. We still need our counters to ground truth these big data estimates because they are the closest measure that we have to actual activity on the ground. And so we need both. There are, of course, a number of challenges that we saw with crowdsourced data as we've been working with these data sets over the past few years. These data sets keep changing over time. The processing at the back end changes, the network changes, the data itself changes. So it's really difficult if you're a researcher to go back and use the old data or to run models back in time. So there are definitely some questions about consistency. And Joe mentioned this earlier, fusing is just not plug and play. There's a lot of work that goes on in the background. So it does require a lot of effort. And of course, the cost of doing this, it's cost to acquire the data itself, but also the cost for cleaning and fusing. In terms of our findings for modeling itself, we found that data fusion as a process works well and is feasible to provide estimates over large areas. As with our WashDOT work, we saw that there is consistency in putting these models over time and space, even across a pandemic. Joe showed this graphic earlier. Our lower volume locations are very challenging to estimate. And part of the problem is because we've always placed our counters only in high volume locations. So we need to do a better job of counter siting and placement. And then pedestrian data brings its whole new set of challenges. We do not have data to begin with. So how do we model in the dark? So that's that. So in terms of recommendations, the first one's pretty obvious. We need to install more permanent counters. Again, these counters need to be in a variety of locations, which include both lower volume locations and on-street locations. A lot of our locations, as Joe pointed out, in Dallas and in Boulder, tend to be off-street trails. So how do we use that data to model on-street activity? On paper, a lot of agencies have a lot of counters cited, but then there are issues with grabbing the data from these counters. They are down for whatever reason. And so you have to plan for ongoing maintenance and then do validation frequently to ensure that the data that we're getting from these counters is accurate. Again, pedestrian count data is needed, urgently needed. We need more of that to build our models. And the emergence of these camera counting technologies and AI-based camera counts, which can automatically provide counts for you at intersections, is probably a great way to get these counts potentially at a lower cost. We had a lot of challenges trying to gather all this data because they came in different formats from different vendors. And so we really think that standardizing and automating these count data can help. For example, we have BikePed portal here at Portland State University, which is a national archive gathering permanent count data, short-term data, and things. So having such a repository can really help. When you want to borrow models or transfer models from one place to another, we strongly caution against transferring local models because they are, more suited to the local context. Instead, use the pool models, which have a variety of context inbuilt in them. And then, if possible, try to re-estimate these model parameters. So in terms of next steps, Joe mentioned this earlier, we did try machine learning earlier with small data, and our findings were pretty similar when it came to estimates when compared to the traditional models. But machine learning methods and techniques are continuously evolving and advancing. And recently we completed a project to improve the accuracy and precision of these bike volumes using machine learning techniques. And we're going to do a similar project on the pedestrian side. We're also trying to work actively with vendors to incorporate additional data for pedestrian modeling because data is so sparse. As Nathan mentioned earlier, Streetlight does not have segment level estimates since early 2022, but they're testing out area level estimates. And so we are trying to see if we can use those estimates as a predictor for pedestrian volumes. We've also done some work to incorporate pedestrian push button actuations to estimate volumes. And so that could be an additional predictor in this methodology or framework. And of course, as always, count data is sparse, so we are always looking for additional data to extend and validate some of the results that we have. So with that, a huge thank you to our whole host of collaborators and more to come as we're actively working on these set of studies. And with that, I will open it up to questions. Thank you.
All right, a few things. We have lots of great online questions, probably have some questions in the room too. So I'm taking director prerogative and I'm going to say that we're going to go over our time. For those of you who either have to leave the room here or online leave right at the top of the hour, if you really want to see the answers to the questions, they'll be on the recording. You can fast forward to the end. But I always like to give folks in the room an opportunity to go first. So there you go.
Maybe more like the question most likely for Joe. I believe you probably alluded to, but how do you, I suppose in your model estimation, your unit analysis are the sites you have counts, and how do you go from there to propagate to the network level? Do you actually pick every single pixels along all the networks and then?
Yeah, it is a good question. We tried several methods, but especially for the bike, we were very focused on, well, our agency folks told us what they need is segment level volumes. And so each individual network link became a kind of pseudo count site. So we took, generally, it's a little more complicated, but we took the midpoint of a link, unless it was very long. And that became the equivalent of a count point location. And then all of those variables were then fused onto that point. So buffers out to capture the contextual information on that segment, things like the facility type, the roadway characteristics, and then the Strava and streetlight data. Well, we didn't use the streetlight data out there. It was not feasible based on the collection method. Just the Strava data was already at the segment level, so that was available. So yeah, it's there may be smarter ways to do it, but that was the most consistent with what we were being asked to produce. But yeah, we should chat more, Li Ming. You might have ideas on solving some of the computational challenges.
I'm gonna play moderator and this is gonna be speed and question and answer. Did I see your hand?
Hands up.
And then I'm gonna go to the online.
Okay, so two questions, but they're quick. So Dallas had the least amount of error. Why do you think that?
That's an easy one. Least variation in count locations. They were all off street, and they were all on trails that probably had a lot of recreational use. So it's always easier to predict when the variance is lower.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And then a broader question is, you mentioned you didn't use Streetlight, you're using Strava. Do you think that if your data source was not a recreational kind of app, or data collection, and it was more kind of breadcrumb like using Google, do you think the models would perform better even?
It's a good question. I mean, one piece of evidence we have is we tested the Strava, just the share of Strava trips that were labeled as commute versus the recreational. And in many cases, they perform better, ignoring that recreational information. So I would say, there's some at least cursory evidence that yes, you do better with a utilitarian focused data source for urban, these are urban area volumes.
All right, I'm gonna tackle some of these online questions and I'm gonna put them in what I hope is a logical order, starting with maybe the category of the count data. And I think one you already answered. So can we append data from traffic cameras to these data sources, using computer vision to derive counts? And I think the answer would be yes.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, if we have cameras and we have counts, we can definitely, do that. I think the method itself is pretty agnostic to where the counts are coming from. We just want to make sure that those counts are valid and accurate.
Which leads to this next question was there a difference in the validity of the data when it came to those permanent counters used? Any that were more prone to errors in the counts? So how does that factor into all of this?
I believe all of our, well, there were different flavors, but I believe all of our permanent counters were eco counters. I think for bike travel, so we didn't get like a side-by-side test of technologies. Yes, there were certainly differences, but it's all anecdotal. I mean, some of the older counters just tend to break down more, and near those periods of breakdown, we had to instigate a lot of quality control filters, because before they go offline, they tend to go haywire, and you get very high or low counts. Yeah, I don't know if you have more to add to that. I lost where I was.
That may be
enough.
enough to answer the question for now.
Hard to say.
Okay, so now let's think about the crowdsourced part of the data. Have you looked into any other fitness geo-tracking apps such as MapMyFitness, and whether they might be different in terms of geographic or demographic differences, et cetera?
I don't think we have. I mean, so Strava packages their counts and produces this product, Strava Metro, where they have the estimates. I know that Strava is a more frequently used, but I think it's quite a common bike fitness app people use. But I don't know if these sort of products coming from something like MapMyFitness.
And a big advantage for Strava is that they make it freely available to public agencies and to researchers. So it's, you don't have to go through that to start off your work.
All right. Related to Strava, did you control for the year the data were collected? And this person is thinking of how Strava changed its user terms and pricing a few years ago and thought that might actually influence the data. They don't say though what year that.
Yeah, it's a good one. Like Sirisha said, it changes in many ways, including on the user side. What we did find, I think that's one of the reasons that when we tested it over time, those relationships drift quite a bit over time. So you really, especially with the Strava, the crowdsourced data, you have to update those parameters so that what does one Strava cyclist equal changes quite a bit over time. And we've seen in other research pre and post pandemic, in a lot of places, the Strava share of total use went up during the pandemic. We don't yet know where it stabilized to now, but it's important, I think, just the shifting nature of this source.
Okay, here's a bit of a different question that got asked early, and then I realized I had the same question. Curious about how proximity to water influences bike ridership, because it was on the map and then it was on your slide.
Yeah, it's somewhat of a mystery, we can speculate, but it was a consistently strong predictor, and it was not just that it's near, like downtown river crossings. We thought about that. There's something about the same facility being near water that attracts more cyclists, and it's just that's our best guess at this point, is that it's appealing to bike near water, whether it's correlated with some other types of facilities, things that we're not measuring well. We don't entirely know, but it was a curious one to us too. But we scrutinized it hard. It wasn't a throw-in variable. It was consistently predictive of cycling activity, controlling for other things. People like water.
Okay, I'm sure there's some other kind of researchers who can tell us why. I think we've sort of answered this, but I want to make sure it's clear. How did you account for errors in the ground truth counters and hand counts? This person says that the Portland automated counters often seem to be under or over, and then the hand counts are really for a short time. So maybe just be clear about that.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, we did not have the budget in any of the projects to undertake a validation for any of the studies. So we assumed that the counts that we got are fairly reflective, but having said that, we did undertake an extensive QA/QC process to make sure that there are no outliers and any odd repeating zeros. Bike Portal has a huge standardized list of criteria that we check, and so we made sure that we applied that consistent methodology to all the counters that we got. But ultimately, the assumption was still there that the counter is recording sort of.
Yeah, just the one other way that we did account for that is when we did that strict test of our crowdsourced data useful, we restricted it to only the best, the highest uptime permanent count locations. So the counters we had the most confidence in to test that hypothesis, because we wanted to be kind of fair to the crowdsourced data. If we're assuming this is a ground truth, we don't want to take the short duration counts and all that.
All right. Have you dropped streetlight data from your model entirely? It sounds like you didn't use it in your most recent work.
Yeah, and that's partly because, we don't have segment level estimates anymore. They've stopped it as of 2022. So we are in conversations with them. They're trying to test out their area level estimates, and that's, I think, going to be available for a few cities. So we're trying to see how we can still incorporate that data, because our results have shown that, they're useful. But whether the new product is still useful, that remains to be seen. But I think the framework that we've set up allows us to test different data sources. And so we're hopeful that.
Yeah, if you're a data vendor out there.
Yeah,
watching and listening,
data vendors.
Yeah.
we're happy to put your data to the test.
A broad question, one of the viewers online, thank you very much, really interesting. Where can we find the report on this research? And what I'm going to preemptively say is that at Trek, I'll work with our great Trek team and make sure that anyone on the webinar gets links to the things that are available, and that we make it clear on our website, like here it all is. Because I think everything you presented today, all of those studies, there is a research report available, correct?
There's a research report that is almost available in some cases, right?
Okay.
The washed up report has not been released yet, and
Okay.
the pedestrian report is is about to be, right?
Is about to. Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. So the few things that we'll alert you to, but we'll make sure it's clear on our website. And let's see, the studies summarized today covering estimating current volumes. Would the same methods be used for forecasting volumes on facilities that don't yet exist?
I mean, the short answer is no, because there wouldn't be the crowdsourced data component, right? You can't get Strava data from 2026. You could back off to just the static models, but those, didn't perform great on their own. I mean, at that point, you're more in a regional travel modeling context, right? Looking at future years. So you could not apply them in the way we did because you're missing some of the inputs. Unless you just wanted to do some kind of a growth factor approach, I suppose.
Okay, yeah, I'm starting to think that through myself. Okay, I've not read this question yet, but so here goes. Thank you. Washington State DOT is purchasing 2 Citix AI Evo counters from EcoCounter to be installed this spring with the aim of evaluating pre and post construction usage. Oh, sorry, this is just a comment. This is a comment from a data person with Washington State DOT. That they are gonna be collecting some of this AI vision type data to do some pre-post counts. So that might be an opportunity to check the models. And Denver Regional COG and City of Boulder are embarking on something similar this year. I think I've almost covered, but I realize I should go back to the room to see. Really appreciate, and then I will, this is a very specific question. Would it be feasible to incorporate delivery service work, perhaps through delivery app data, to see where to best support cycling for deliveries and ensuring safe cycling infrastructure to support this work? So this is a little more thinking about applications of this.
That's not one we've heard in 5 years of work on this, is it? No.
There you go, future research
That's right.
agenda. And then I'm gonna answer one of these. So first question, did your static data include census commute statistics? Yes, bike commute share. How about high quality household travel survey data?
No, we did not incorporate travel survey data. Something here in Oregon, we're looking forward to having a new version of very soon, in the next couple of months.
And one of the applications of the model we were thinking is to compare the estimates from the model to the travel survey estimates to see how well each of them are performing. Of course, neither of it is ground truth, so we don't know like which one is correct, but at least for comparative purposes, you can check.
All right, I appreciate your patience staying over the lightning round of questions. I thought many of them were quite good. So I'm going to just quickly wrap up and thank everyone. I'm behind the camera, so you don't see me, but thank you everyone online. Thank you those in the room. And those online, you'll get a quick survey afterwards. Hope you fill that out, and thank our speakers for joining us.
Thank you.